Welcome, everyone. Today we're taking a look at downtown St. Paul, Minnesota. Think of this as your inside guide to a city just packed with stories. It's really perfect if you're curious and love digging into the history of places.
Yeah, absolutely. And to do that, we've pulled together quite a bit of material. We're looking at historical studies, things people have shared on Reddit, Wikipedia for some basics, news articles, lists of historic sites, a real mix.
Right, and the goal here is to kind of illuminate the history, the big landmarks, the culture, politics, the buildings, of course, and maybe some surprising facts that, really make downtown St. Paul what it is. So maybe let's start with the basics. Where exactly is downtown St. Paul?
Okay, good place to start. According to the official historic context studies, the boundaries are, well, largely set by the Mississippi River on the south and east side. Then you've got Kellogg Boulevard on the west, and Interstate 94 pretty much forms the northern edge. It kind of jogs south around Broadway. And one thing to keep in mind, there's been a lot of redevelopment since the big survey in '82, so we'll mostly be focusing on the buildings that are still standing, the ones you can actually, see and connect with today.
Makes sense. So thinking back to the very beginning, when the city was first laid out, what did that look like? Were there, central spots planned from the get-go?
Yes, there were. The original plan actually included two main parks, green spaces. Rice Park, that was donated way back in 1849 by Henry Rice and Smith Park, which we now know as Mears Park.
Ah, Rice Park. Still such a hub.
Exactly. It became this real focal point for cultural life pretty quickly, and it still is. You've got the Ordway, the River Center, the Minnesota Club, the Public Library, the Landmark Center, all right there.
Right.
And an interesting little tidbit, the east side of Rice Park used to have open-air market stalls. That's actually how Market Street got its name. Gives you a little picture of that early commercial buzz.
Huh. I didn't know that. And the Mississippi River obviously looms large in St. Paul's story. How did that shape downtown right at the start?
Oh, it was fundamental. Yeah. Absolutely key. The lower landing, that was the main spot for steamboats. So naturally, that's where the first settlement popped up and where early business really started.
Okay.
And as more people came, things just sort of spread up the bluff. The area called Upper Town eventually grew into the main business district, basically, the downtown we're talking about now. The geography really dictated things early on.
So from steamboats, how did things change as transportation evolved? Railroads and such.
Yeah, transportation kept being a huge driver. When the railroads arrived, late 19th, early 20th century, that had a massive impact, especially down in Lower Town.
Oh, you can still see that.
Totally. You look at buildings like the Union Depot, built between 1917 and 23, or the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railroad office building from 1916-17. They're big statements from that era.
Yeah.
Though, interestingly, by the 1920s, you started to see some of the big warehouse companies moving out towards the Midway District, maybe looking for more space, maybe better rail connections outside the immediate core, perhaps.
Okay, so that gives us a good sense of the growth pattern. Let's zoom in on the buildings themselves. What are some of the architectural highlights that really tell St. Paul's story?
Oh, there's a fantastic mix downtown. Different eras, different styles. The historic context studies point out some great examples. We could start with, say, the early churches.
Yeah.
There is the Church of the Assumption, built between 1871 and 74. It's this really striking limestone building. You can't miss its twin spires. It was built for the city's German Catholic community.
Impressive.
And then you have the First Baptist Church over on Wakuta Street. That one's from 1874-75. What's significant there is it might be the first building in St. Paul made with Kasota stone.
Kasota stone, that's the light-colored limestone.
Exactly. It became a really popular local building material later on. So that church is kind of an early adopter.
Interesting. So those churches are like anchors from that early period. What about the business side of things in the late 1800s? What buildings represent that?
Well, that was a big time for wholesale and manufacturing buildings. You had places like the Noyes Brothers and Cutler Wholesale Building from 1886. Then there's the Conance Saddlery Company Building, 1893, and the Kohler and Hinrichs Company Building from 1891.
Saddlery, wholesale, right, supplying the growing region.
Precisely. These buildings housed the businesses doing just that. They really reflect that burst of economic activity.
And were there big public buildings going up around then too, civic structures?
Oh, yes. The old Federal Courts Building is a prime example, built between 1894 and 1902. It's this incredible mix, mostly Romanesque, with the big arches and solid stonework, but it also has these French chateau-esque touches, like the steep roofs and towers.
And it overlooks Rice Park, right?
Right. Prime location made it a major landmark, and of course today we know it as the Landmark Center.
Yeah, such a beautiful reuse of a historic space. Okay, so moving into the 20th century, how did retail start showing up in the architecture?
Well, that's when 7th Street really emerged as the main shopping drag. You see two major department stores from that era, the Golden Rule for 1915 and the Emporium, which was built in 1911 and then expanded just a few years later in 1915.
Big buildings, I imagine.
Huge. They really show that growth of, consumer culture and how important downtown was as the place to shop back then.
It sounds like downtown wasn't just for work and shopping, though. It was a place people gathered.
Absolutely. Social clubs were a really big deal. There's the Saint Paul Athletic Club, built in 1916 to 1918. It's in that Renaissance revival style, very grand.
Okay.
And the Minnesota Club, they had an earlier clubhouse, but built a new one right on Rice Park in 1909. These were key places for the city's social and business leaders to meet. Really important part of the city's fabric.
Right. So moving a bit further into the 20th century, say the 20s and 30s, what stands out then?
That period, roughly 1926 to 1936, was quite a boom time for major public buildings. The standout has got to be the St. Paul City Hall Ramsey County Courthouse.
The Art Deco one.
That's the one, right on Kellogg Boulevard. It's just a classic example of Art Deco, the geometric shapes, the ornamentation, that setback tower. It really screams modernity for its time.
And isn't there a famous sculpture inside?
Yes. Carl Mills's God of Peace statue, the Peace Memorial, it's massive and incredibly striking. The whole building, with the relief sculptures on the outside too, is just packed with significant architectural and artistic details.
Wow. What else from that era? Skyscrapers starting to appear?
Yeah, the early ones, like the Northern States Power Building, finished in 1930. It uses local Minnesota stone, Morton Gneiss and Mankato stone, and has these cool metal sculptures that represent, well, power, fittingly enough, starting to shape that skyline.
Okay, and is there anything maybe a bit quirkier? Something with a unique story?
Well, you absolutely have to mention Mickey's Diner.
Ah, yes, the dining car.
Exactly. It wasn't built here. It was prefabricated, actually, in New Jersey back in 1937 and then shipped out and installed here in 39. It's amazing that it's still there, still operating.
Yeah.
A real survivor, a true pre-war dining car.
It's such an icon, right near the Assumption Church.
Yep. Definitely one of the most unique and, frankly, beloved landmarks downtown.
A little slice of Americana. Okay, what about more recent developments, say, latter half of the 20th century?
Sure. You had the Warren Burger Federal Courts building go up in 1966. And interestingly, its construction kind of spurred the movement to save the old federal courts building.
Oh, interesting twist.
Yeah. Then you also saw things like the Kellogg Square Apartments in 72, providing more downtown housing. The Arts and Science Building in 64, and the Science Museum of Minnesota building in 78, reflecting, those growing needs for cultural spaces and education right downtown.
Right.
Oh, and we shouldn't forget the Pioneer Building. It goes back to 1890, actually. It was originally connected to the Endicott building next door. It's known for its really detailed design and apparently had one of the first glass elevators in the country.
Wow, 1890s glass elevator. Okay. Now, the Minnesota State Capitol isn't technically downtown by the boundaries you mentioned, but it's right there. How does it fit into the picture?
Yeah, it's just outside that core area, but its presence is obviously huge. And the artwork inside, well, it depicts all these key moments in Minnesota history. There's a significant focus on the American Civil War, for instance. It provides that wider state historical context right on downtown's doorstep.
Okay, so we've got a good feel for the physical evolution and the buildings. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the people, the cultures and communities that have really shaped downtown's identity.
St. Paul's definitely got a rich, diverse cultural history. You had large waves of immigrants, historically German, Irish, Norwegian, Swedish communities were all significant and left their mark.
Right.
But it's also really crucial, I think, to talk about the deep history of the African-American community in St. Paul. There's a specific study on this, the St. Paul African-American Historic and Cultural Context, which is incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. That history is fundamental. Where does that story begin in St. Paul?
Well, the earliest documented presence actually connects back to Fort Snelling in the 1800s. That includes people brought there as enslaved individuals like Rachel and Dred Scott, whose fight for freedom became, a major national case.
Right, the Dred Scott decision.
Exactly. And as St. Paul itself started developing near the river landings, free African American communities began to establish themselves. A man named James Thompson is noted as the very first documented black resident of St. Paul proper.
Okay. And how did these early communities develop?
Well, after the Emancipation Proclamation, you saw more migration-free black people and those formerly enslaved moving to St. Paul, and they became a really important part of the city's labor force. And vital institutions started forming. Pilgrim Baptist Church, for example, was established way back in 1866, a cornerstone of the early community.
Oh, 1866.
Yeah. And despite facing a lot of discrimination, like segregation in schools, a really resilient and educated black community grew. They started their own civic groups, businesses. Figures like James T. Lyles and James Kidd Hilliard were prominent entrepreneurs, and they had their own publications, like The Appeal, which was vital for news and community voice.
So really building a community infrastructure, even with those obstacles.
Precisely. You see the early formation of civil rights groups, too. The St. Paul NAACP chapter started in 1912, and the Every Woman Suffrage Club, led by Nellie Griswold Francis, fighting for voting rights.
Showing that push for equality early on.
Definitely. And then the St. Paul Urban League was founded in 1923 specifically to tackle those social and economic inequalities. Plus, you had social clubs like the Sterling Club, which were really important community spaces when segregation limited other options.
It's important to remember those challenges, though. You mentioned segregation in schools. What other major hurdles did the community face?
Well, the school segregation was a long fight, though eventually people like the Farr sisters broke through and were hired as teachers. But perhaps the most devastating disruption came later in the 1960s with urban renewal and freeway construction.
I-94, right, through Rondo.
Exactly. The construction of I-94 essentially demolished the Rondo neighborhood. This was a really vibrant, established African-American heart of the city, just wiped out. The annual Rondo Days Festival now is held to remember that community and its history. It's a really important commemoration.
A painful but crucial piece of the city's history.
Huh.
Okay, beyond that vital history, what other cultural spots or experiences might our listeners find in and around downtown St. Paul today, maybe drawing from some of those local discussions you mentioned?
Yeah, looking at what locals talk about, there's quite a variety. Como Park Zoo and Conservatory always comes up. People seem to really appreciate their animal care. The Science Museum, we mentioned its building downtown. The Landmark Center itself has some smaller museums inside. I think there's one on wood turning. And a music museum. For food, Casetta's, the big Italian deli, is kind of an institution.
Can't miss Casetas.
Definitely not. The Minnesota History Center, while just outside downtown near the Capitol, is obviously a major resource. There's also the Twin City Model Railroad Museum, which sounds kind of fun and niche, and Can Wonderland for something more artsy and playful.
Okay.
Seasonally, the St. Paul Christmas Market is popular. If you like getting outdoors, people recommend walking or biking along Lilydale Road. Apparently, you might even see bald eagles there.
Oh, cool.
And there's shadow falls for some nature. For book lovers, subtext books gets mentioned. And breweries. There's St. Paul Brewing, Blackstack, Waldman, Bad Weather, several options around. Plus, people point towards the west side for good Mexican food and bakeries, and Selby Avenue for a mix of restaurants.
That's a great list. Lots of variety there. Okay, let's turn towards the political dimension of downtown St. Paul.
Well, obviously, its role as the political center is clear, being home to both the state capitol nearby and the City Hall courthouse right downtown. And those urban renewal projects in the 60s we talked about, like with Rondo, those were major political decisions with huge social consequences.
Right, not just infrastructure projects.
Not at all. And it's interesting, even now you see discussions like the one on Reddit about the Central Station development proposal. It shows there's ongoing debate and community interest in how downtown develops, especially around transit hubs, concerns about safety, how public money is used. That's all part of the current political landscape.
And didn't you mention something about rent control recently?
Yeah, that's another example of ongoing city politics. The St. Paul City Council recently approved more changes to its rent control ordinance. So, the political process keeps shaping the city's economic and social environment.
It definitely sounds like that. Push and pull between development, community, and politics is always humming along. All right, as we start to wrap this up, any particularly fascinating or maybe surprising facts about downtown St. Paul or nearby that stick out?
Well, the James J. Hill House on Summit Avenue, again, technically just outside downtown, but it's such a monster landmark, represents that whole Gilded Age railroad tycoon era. People call it Minnesota's Downton Abbey.
Yeah, you can see why.
It's quite something. And a little connection to the Foch Tower, that iconic building over in Minneapolis. The company behind it, W.B. Foch's company, actually went bankrupt right after the 1929 stock market crash. So a bit of a St. Paul, Minneapolis link there through that history.
Interesting.
And something maybe less glamorous, back in 1904, downtown St. Paul actually got hit pretty hard by severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, caused significant damage to buildings. A reminder that nature plays a role too.
Wow, 1904.
Yeah. And on a practical note for visitors, people often mention the skyway system can be confusing at first, and also that downtown St. Paul tends to quiet down relatively early in the evening compared to, say, Minneapolis.
Good tips for anyone planning a visit. So, wrapping up our exploration, it's really clear that downtown St. Paul is this incredibly layered place. You've got the history, the architecture, the different cultures, the politics, the ongoing changes, all woven together.
Exactly. Hopefully walking through all this gives you a much richer sense of the place, maybe sparks a few aha moments about how it all fits together.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener. Think about how all these layers, the history we talked about, the communities, the buildings still standing, the ongoing development, how they all continue to interact and shape what downtown St. Paul is today and what it might become tomorrow.
Yeah, maybe it even inspires you to go explore some of those streets and stories for yourself.